Hi, Soch 322. By this time that you're watching this lecture, you're probably fairly upset with how difficult the church-state reading was that we had for this week. I did that on purpose. First off, it kind of gets us going again after spring break, kind of a wake-up call. That's less of the purpose. More of the purpose is to give you a sense that this topic, which we'll only spend a little bit of time on kind of formally this week, actually drives the next couple of weeks. And the reading shows us that, one, it's a complex topic. Two, we need to know a little bit about history. And three, the broad cultural category that most of us inherit, this idea that there's a separation of church and state, that there's a wall between church and state, and that church and state are these kind of monolithic ideas. The whole point is to say that we need to kind of throw all that out. Really quickly, the reasons why is because nowhere in our constitutional documents do we actually see the language of wall or separation of church and state. And second off, because when we look through history and we use the lens of sociology to understand the way institutions interact, we know that there's no monolithic idea, that there are trends, that there are broad cultural categories of how state and church actors interact, but that there's no one clear answer. As much as our legal establishment and our jurisprudence tries to always define an answer, the point from this lecture will be to say that's just it. They're always defining an answer, and there's always actors that are pushing the limits of a boundary that is not predefined, but is actually only defined by the ways that the actors push on both sides of the boundary, whether it's from the state side or whether from the church side. So it was a tough reading, but I hope it actually gave you some good historical insight to get started. What I want to do with the lecture today is actually talk a little bit about why we should look at church and state issues, to define what the heck it is we mean by state, which is this kind of vague concept, right? To look at actual church and state interactions, to have some history, and then to look a little bit at the current conflicts. And we finish with the current conflicts, and that's because the next 2 weeks are related issues. Next week we're talking about this idea of civil religion, which is one sociologist in particular's attempt to kind of draw back and say, like, well, if we get past looking at particular religious traditions and just look at religion broadly understood within United States history, what do we come up with? And then 2 weeks from now, we're going to talk about the culture wars argument, which for the last 20 years has really kind of dominated a lot of the scholarship on religion and politics in the United States. And to understand why that is, we got to have some sociological and historical background to the whole idea of church and state relationships. So let me kind of erase this intro here, and we'll dive in. Why should we look at church and state relationships? Well, because first off, coming out of our last unit, which was on church and sex theory, it is clear that the interaction between church and state influences what religious groups look like and influences what the state looks like. So it's this dynamic process of church and state actors of influencing each other. A great example of this was that in the founding of the United States, the Baptist religious tradition was radically democratic, okay? So you could go to any community, there would be Baptist groups, and they're radically democratic in that they govern themselves. This was an offshoot of the Protestant tradition with very local kind of authority structures, generally policing their own religious worship, their own authority, their own decision making about where to put a building, who to have as the elder of the church, that sort of thing. What we find is that that religious tradition has shifted greatly over time to the point where in the 1980s in the Southern Baptist Conference there was a revolution that ended up with certain groups gaining power of that denomination. This story is really told well by a woman named Nancy Ammerman in a book called one book called Bible Believers, and I think the other one was called Baptist Battles. I can check back on that if you want to know. But what she tells us is that partly the change in the American state of more centralization, more kind of federal authority actually had some impact in the way that this Baptist denomination started to organize itself, so that over 200 years we go from kind of radical democratic isolated individual Baptist congregations to the point where we are today of having a Baptist denomination that has policies that it puts out for its thousands of members. So we see that there's this interaction between church and state and how they affect each other. Another reason to study church and state issues is because some of the hottest issues that you find on the front page of any newspapers today have to do with church and state. This boundary which we're going to see is a boundary that's shifting, not because of some pure law or pure idea of what the boundary is, but how the actors on both sides of the boundary push it. What are some of these hot issues? Well, prayer in schools, for one. Religious monuments and parks is another example. A favorite example of mine, and you can go and Google this right now, is called Bong Hits for Jesus. Check that out. That's a Supreme Court case, a hot case that had a lot to do with church and state relationships. And then another question is chaplains in the military, which is our reading for the end of this week. What's important here is that both church and state are institutions that are looked to regulate all sorts of our lives. Those parts of our lives that aren't regulated or driven by the market, we usually look to state or church in terms of both institutional structures as well as symbolic ideas about the meaning of our lives and how we should behave with each other. So you can see why then, if these are such powerful institutions, why it is that they become these sites of political and symbolic struggle, and why then the relationships between the two are continually kind of in tension with each other. So before we go any further, let's talk really quick about what the heck we mean by state, okay? State, broadly understood, we have a couple of things. First off, we have what we call state actors, and these are actors at various levels. These are courts, these are legislative bodies, and these are individuals. And at each of these levels, courts, legislatives, individuals, we have both state, i.e. U.S. state, California, Indiana, Arizona, as well as federal. Okay, so right off the bat we see that state actors are characterized by being at numerous levels and kind of cross-cutting each other. When we talk about state in the United States too, we also have a couple of key things. First off, we think in terms of a liberal state, which means in the liberal tradition of kind of balancing power, which we learned in our high school civics classes. We think of a democratic state in terms of the people and democratic processes being at the most basic levels of the state and having certain liberties, and this connects with this liberal idea, which protect individuals against the state. And so when the rest of this lecture and our readings we talk about the state, we want to keep in mind basically the complexity of all these things, that there's certain ways of being in the United States that is different than if we were studying state, say in Europe or Africa or Asia or something like this. The implications of what state means for our class is that any sort of conflict around religion or around church is going to fall possibly in a whole ton of levels. It could fall at a state level in terms of what a state court has said. It could fall at a federal level in terms of laws that Congress is trying to pass. It could fall at both these levels in terms of what individuals are saying, or in terms of what individual religious groups are trying to do. They could try to do things at the local community level, the regional state level, or the federal level. So the idea here is that the topic of church and state relationships is central, but it will be addressed differently according to which level of state it falls in and where it falls at in time. So asking the same question in 1800 is very different than asking the same question in 2009, given all sorts of changes that have occurred in both the religious sphere in terms of growing pluralization in the United States, but also on the state sphere in terms of we now have more states, we now have a more powerful central federal state, and we also have this kind of long history of jurisprudence that operates at all of these levels. I'm going to take a quick break for a drink of water. I'll be right back.